I explain relative modes in simple terms in this video right here, but I think the true power of modes comes from using them parallel to the key of a composition. I mean, let's face it, if you have a progression in C major using a couple of chords, and you write a solo or a melody on top of that C major using the C major scale, it's going to sound really good, but it's not going to be the most original or inventive work you've ever heard. On the flip side, if you have something in the C major scale and you look to a parallel mode for notes that are not in that scale, it will sound different and you will strike a chord, pun intended, with your audience in that you're using notes that are outside of your key. I'll demonstrate that in a minute, but let's see what we can do with the major scale. Now, if you only learn one thing about music theory, let that be the major scale. I'm a big fan of inferred knowledge, taking stuff that you know and inferring the stuff that you don't. So if we look at the C major scale, there's 7 notes out of 12 in that scale, and actually all the major scales only have 7 out of the 12 notes. We have a C, a D, an E, F, G, A, and B notes in there. So we already have a lot of information there about the notes that we can play that are outside of the scale, such as the C sharp, the D sharp, the E sharp, the F sharp, and the G sharp. So if the purpose of learning modes is to color outside the line, do we really need to learn modes? We already have everything we need. So I've got a basic progression here in the key of C major, and I'm going to play the notes of C major right on top of it. So it sounds pretty stock, and this is something that's not super imaginative. You've probably heard it before. You'll notice I'm not doing any bends. I'm just sticking to the actual notes to just not add too much color. Now what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to remove this D note from my scale, and I'm going to replace it with a D sharp, which is outside of my C major scale. Let's see if we can make that work at all. So it definitely sounds different. You've painted outside of the lines. I'm not sure if it's good or not. Up to you to make it work. So let's try that again, except this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this G note here, and I'm going to play a G sharp instead. So no G, just the G sharp. So it's definitely got a sound to it, so using that G sharp note instead. I think what we can gather from that is that these notes outside of the scale that we're using, they're really good as passage notes if you want to transition to another note that's in the scale, but every time we seem to land on those notes, it doesn't sound all that great. So part of the problem with what we've just done is that even though our chord progression is very simple, we're using 6 out of the 7 notes in our scale. So we've married ourselves very tightly to that C major scale. And any note that we play that is outside of that conflicts with one of the notes that's in the underlying chord progression. Let's try this again. I'm going to substitute the D note with the D sharp note, but I'm just going to play a simple C chord as the backdrop, and we'll see what we can do with that. All right, here we go. So by just playing a C chord underneath, now we can use our D sharp note, which is in another scale, which is in another key, and it fits nicely, and it actually sounds pretty good, but we've had to simplify what happens underneath. So let's try the exercise again one more time. This time I'm going to replace the D with the D sharp, and I'm also going to replace this G with a G sharp. Let's see what we can do with that. We still have that single C chord that's playing underneath. So I think that sounds interesting. It's certainly not run-of-the-mill. It's probably something that you haven't heard before, and I think in the context of a song or a more complete production, I think it can work. And you know what? We didn't use any modes, we just experimented with a couple of notes outside the scale. We'll get to modes in just a minute, but I think the point I'm trying to make here is that music theory is really nice, and it certainly is a great tool, but a little bit of experimentation and a lot of listening can sure go a long way. In fact, there are so many documented cases of bands out there that have very limited musical knowledge, but they've made a great career with great music that was a hit at the time with very, very little musical knowledge. And decades later, we're still listening to stuff by the Beatles, as an example, or even Foo Fighters. Even if that's not your cup of tea, these folks have sold billions of records and they've made a huge career, and their music is still listened to today. So let's color outside the lines by using modes as a tool, and we're going to do it with deliberation and intent. If you look at any of the courses online, they usually teach modes with a whole bunch of notes and shapes, and it really seems to be overly complicated, and it's probably because they're trying to sell you some online course or to get you to subscribe to something or pay for their Patreon. Hey, if you're liking this video and you're finding value in it, please consider doing those things that YouTube people do, the likes and the subscribes and dropping a comment. I don't get paid to do these videos. I don't have a Patreon. I'm not selling you anything. It takes a lot of hours to make these videos. I'm just trying to help out. So drop me a comment, and if this video was not for you, you think it's the lamest thing ever, feel free to just move along. All right, thanks. So let's take a moment to analyze that really simple chord progression and figure out why it is that some notes didn't work. So the chord progression was really simple. It was a C chord, which is a C, an E, and a G note. It was a G major chord, which is a G, a B, and a D. And it was an A minor chord, which is an A, a C, and an E note. So the one thing you'll notice is that out of our 7-note scale, we're utilizing 6 of those 7 notes, even with this very basic chord progression. So at any given time, including a D sharp or a G sharp in there, is probably really bound to just sound odd because it's really neighboring a lot of those notes. So the one takeaway we have is that the more complex our underlying progression is, the more we're married to the scale, and the harder it's going to be to use modes to actually sound different from that without it sounding completely out of key. Now there's one note in that scale that we're not using, and that's this F note. So what we're going to try to do is use a mode to replace this F note with say this F sharp. So keeping all of the notes there, but we're substituting the F note with an F sharp. Let's take a moment to understand how parallel modes work using this music modes chart. So here on the rows, we have all of the 12 notes. So for C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and all of the 5 sharps and flats that are there. And those map to the exact 12 major keys that are available. There are no more or no less than 12 major keys. Now at the top here, since every major key has exactly 7 notes out of 12, that maps to 12 modes. Now the first mode here is Ionian, which is essentially the major mode. Now in order to find parallel modes, what we need to do is look up the tonic notes of the progression, of the key of the progression that we are working with. Now, in our case, we've been sticking to C major. So C major is the key of our song or chord progression, and the parallel modes that we would find, I'm circling them right here. And the way that you would use this chart is that if you want to look at what the nodes are in C Dorian, for instance, well, you would find the tonic note of C, because we're in the key of C major. You would find the tonic note of C, and B flat in our case is the major scale that corresponds to C Dorian. So the notes that are in the C Dorian scale are C, D, E flat, F, G, A, and B flat. Now there are some similarities between C Dorian, which is B flat major. So there's some similarities between that and C major. So C and D are common notes. The E flat of C Dorian is out of scale for C major. F, G, and A are the same. And then there's this B flat here that's out of scale for C major. So that could make for some really interesting color if we went that route. Let's try another example. So if we wanted the C Phrygian mode, we would simply find the C in the Phrygian table. That maps to A flat major, that scale. These are the 7 notes that are in C Phrygian. So C, D flat, E flat, F, G, A flat, and B flat. So as you can tell here, this mode is quite different from C major. And if you have a chord progression in C major, using C Phrygian on top of it is bound to clash. You have a D flat that's here between the C and the D. You have an E flat that's between the D and the E here. The F and the G are the same. Between the G and the A, you would have an A flat that is here. So I'm just picking these notes. Between the A and the B, you would have a B flat. So playing a chord progression in C major and throwing a C sharp or a D flat on top or a D, that's bound to just not sound good. So that's essentially how the modes, this mode chart actually works. Now in our case, we want to find the mode that corresponds to replacing the F note in C major with an actual F sharp. And that's easy to spot in this case. So if we look at the C Lydian mode, it uses the C, the D, the E notes, the G, the A, and the B. There's no F, but there is an F sharp. So what we're going to try now is using a C major progression, and we're going to substitute our F for an F sharp, which will lead us to a melody written in C, using the C Lydian mode. Let's give this a try. So there we have it, a C major chord progression, pretty simple, but with a C Lydian melody on top of it. And you can really tell when we landed on that F sharp note, it sounded really, to me anyway, it sounded really sad and it really stuck out. And that's just one example of how you can use parallel modes to go fetch notes that are outside of the scale of what you're playing. And in this case, we picked a note that was not used in our chord progression, and we used the modes. We took the time to understand our chord progression, which notes in there were used, and which ones we could probably borrow from parallel modes. But in the end, did we really need modes to do that? A bit of experimentation would have led us to the same result. So I think in the end that modes are a great tool to help accelerate the composition and the creative process. But nothing is going to match your ears and perhaps a bit of experimentation. So there was another mode that was really simple and similar to Lydian, which was Mixolydian. That one there introduced this B flat note, which, let's try to build something with that. C Mixolydian. B flat. So what have we learned with all of this? If you experiment musically without knowing any theory, your creative process will be done without understanding, and that's perfectly fine. Now, using music theory as a tool to understand what it is that you're doing will probably lead to a creative process that is faster and more methodical. But you learn at that point, the danger is that you might start to color out outside the lines within the lines that you know. And that can actually hinder your creative process in a way. Memorizing scales and patterns is a really good way to attain a high level of speed, because you can just rip up and down those without putting too much thought into it or worrying about where you are or which notes you're playing. But that won't lead to the most creative work. You're just robotically playing stuff really fast that is known to sound really good. So in the end, you need to decide where your involvement with the instrument is going to happen. If you don't really want to practice a whole lot, well, you're going to spend a lot of your time, like we just did right now, in thinking and analyzing and experimenting. That's going to lead you to play slowly, but at least you will understand what you were doing. And there's nothing wrong with that. In terms of composition, that's fine. You're in a studio and you're recording music and you're deliberately thinking out what it is that you're doing. At the other end of the spectrum, if you want to be able to just blaze up and down on a solo in any key, you're going to have to invest a lot of time into practicing those scales and memorizing all those positions on the fretboard. There's probably no other way around it. That will lead you to playing without a whole lot of thinking, but you're going to be able to do that very fast and on the fly. I think somewhere in the middle is where most guitar players try to land. They want to have a good understanding of how things work so that they can compose and understand and be creative with an understanding. But at the same time, they do want to build up a vocabulary of riffs and licks that they can play relatively fast, knowing a specific position or location on the neck and not have to think about it. And if you look at a lot of guitar content online, you'll see that a lot of guitar players, when you give them an instrument and nothing else around them, they will revert down to those licks and that vocabulary of stuff that they know how to play really well, because that's their vocabulary, and they can do that without thinking, on the spot. Here it is, and that's what I play. So finding your common ground between the amount of time you practice, the amount of stuff that you have to memorize, and the amount of stuff that you have to learn and retain, and the amount of stuff that you want to understand to be able to create and develop music. It's really up to you. With that, happy practicing. Good luck.